So I think I'm about 75% done. I should have about 3 more passes. The last pass I'll probably have to drill an extra set of rows, but things are going pretty well. You could see from the camera, by the naked eye, the grid is still pretty good. There's a couple little inconsistencies. The dark holes you see are where the bit burnt a little bit, so I might end up having to sand those out, but in general it's coming along really well. You also might notice that I flipped the piece so that it's easier to drill on this side, and I have gone through in a couple spots, and if I mess up my outfeed table, it's not that big of a deal versus drilling into the cast iron top of my table saw would not be super great. So before I flipped it, I put a little piece of blue tape with a reference arrow on it, as well as a piece of blue tape with a reference arrow on my jig, because you're going to be lining up the jig not necessarily backwards, but the other way, because when it was flipped the other way, that blue tape was down here, and I was referencing off this edge, and now I'm referencing off that edge. It's just kind of a visual reminder to help me after I flipped it. I just finished up the last bit of holes on this, and what I did was I drew my line from the edge, and then I just brought the holes as close to the edge of that line without going over it. And the nice thing is you could kind of see that this line is fairly straight with the line I drew off the edge of my plywood, which just is another way to show you that this is all kind of lined up nicely. That's what it looks like. The underside of this, which you'll see when I flip it, is completely tore up. Tear out was just unavoidable with the way I did this. I didn't want to waste an entire sheet of sheet goods by putting this on top of it to avoid tear out as much as possible, because I'm under the impression that this is going up against the wall and you won't see it anyways. So I'll just sand that lightly. The other nice thing about using this jig is now I have, except for this light line I drew, no pencil marks on the top. And since this is a finer grade sheet of ply, all I'm going to have to do is lightly hit it with a sander and the top's done. One other thing is this bit, obviously, I'll calculate how many holes that ended up being in the end, but you're drilling a lot, and this bit worked great. At one point I actually switched to a spade bit because I hit a screw on my assembly tabletop right about there underneath all of this and instantly dulled this bit. So I tried using a spade bit, and that was horrible. It went slowly, the cut wasn't as nice. So I ended up sharpening this bit in order to start using it again. I'm going to put a link in the description on how to do that. I didn't have the proper tools to sharpen mine, so I kind of haphazardly did it and got away with it. But I'll put a link in the description of a video that shows you how to sharpen these and what tools you need, because you could get away with not sharpening it if you don't hit any hardware, but it'll just make the whole process faster if you kind of hone the edges a little bit during this process, because it is so many holes. Yesterday I was talking a little bit about sharpening that bit, and I was cleaning up this morning all the shavings from these holes, and you could see these are the shavings from the first round of drilling holes. They're nice clean shavings, almost kind of like shavings you get off a plane. And towards the end, this is kind of what they ended up with, this kind of gritty, choppy shavings. And even the holes towards the end, you could see they're a little rougher around the edges. So as a general rule of thumb with any sort of thing you're using that is metal for cutting, shaving, if you've watched any of my bare videos, you know with the chainsaw it's very similar, that the edges of those bits will dull over time, and you could see the difference in the efficiency of which they cut. So just a heads up, if you're doing something like this, I'm going to, like I said, link in the description how to sharpen those drill bits, because it could save you some time down the line, especially if you are drilling this many holes. Gradually, as it loses its edge, and needs to be honed, you probably won't notice how much longer it's taking to drill all these holes, but in actuality it is. So there you can see how bad that tear out is, and this is mostly avoidable if you have a solid structure underneath the piece. To some extent you are going to get tear out drilling this many holes. And like I said, since this is going up against the wall, I wasn't super concerned about it. But I am going to sand this smooth, remove all these little pieces, flip it back over, I'll sand the other side as well. So I have this sanded down to where I want it, and I pre-cut some lengths of my veneer for my long edges of my plywood. Veneered those long sides and the back piece there, and now I'm doing the front. The key to success for this is you always want to have a decent amount of an overhang on this edge. As you heat this up and the glue starts to melt, if you're really close to the edge here, sometimes this has a consistency to slide as you're pushing force on that iron going the other way, and this will end up short if you're not careful. But basically what I'm doing is you're just ironing this, and I apply heat to it until at the edge, I'm going to try and zoom in and see if you could see it when I start doing it again, you'll see the glue melt. When that glue melts, I take the iron off and apply a little bit of pressure with that roller and then just keep moving. I'm going to give that glue substantial time to set up before I go through and trim it. While that's setting up, I'm going to make this holder for all the corks. It's kind of like a trough, and I want to make that out of a single 2x6. This is a pretty straight 2x6. I bought it yesterday, so it should stay pretty straight while I'm working on it. And 2x6s, I've said this in all my videos, but I'll say it again, I prefer to buy 2x6s over 2x4s. They're just a nicer grade of lumber. They're usually pretty straight, not as many knots and stuff in them, and you can get more bang for your buck with them. So what I'm going to do to make this go even further is I'm going to rip it down the center. These are about 1.5 inches wide, which will leave me with a little less than 3/4 of an inch. I'll have 2 slabs. I'll probably cut one of those slabs in half. One of them will be able to be screwed right into the wall, and then I'll come out from that on bottom, and then probably an angled part up the side, as well as maybe some partitions in the middle for everything to be structural. Should be pretty easy to make. I'm probably just going to film that process now that I told you exactly what I'm going to do versus stopping and explaining everything along the way. So I definitely need to get my blade sharpened. Cutting this in half was a real task, but I managed to get it in half. After propping it in place, I kind of realized that cutting this one in half, I just won't have enough to put those corks in. I don't know how many corks they have, but if there's 1,600 holes in the plywood or thereabout, this is probably going to need a ton of corks if you want to fill the board. So I have this piece from another job. It's 1/2 inch plywood, the veneered ply just like this, so I'll have to put that trim on the edge. I'm going to cut this at an angle. I'm going to keep this the size it is. I'm going to cut this at an angle but mount it about there for structure, and a piece that matches that angle, and kind of screw everything into place. I'm probably going to try cutting this at a 15-degree angle to start and see how that looks. So with all my pieces for my dividers cut and everything, I'm just going to put some glue on this back side here, tack everything into place with some glue and some brads. Once it's set up, I'll go back through and add some screws. Now usually I don't rely on butt joints, which is what this joint in the back is and what all the other joints are going to be. But this is only holding corks, they're not super heavy, and it's kind of a secondary piece to the cork board, as well as the fact that I've made those picture hangers that are similar to this with a lip in front, and you kind of hang them on the wall like a shelf and put pictures on them, and I've built them similarly to this. I haven't had any fall apart. I do talk a lot about solid joints in my videos, but at the same time I try not to overbuild stuff that doesn't need special joinery. So with the set up a little bit, I went and cut a bunch of these that match the angle of the edge. They'll go inside here. I'm just going to glue them right now, and then later I'll sink some screws into them. I don't think I filmed it, but I put some screws in this as well. And this will just tie the front to the back, as well as the bottom. Your weakest joint is going to be this back piece here. There's not a lot of stuff there, as well as the front. There's just not a lot of wood, even with the glue and the brads holding everything together. So with some glue and some screws in these pieces, it'll hold everything together. So like I said, I'm just going to glue them, and then maybe even tomorrow I'll go through and put probably a screw through the front, the bottom, and the back. And then I showed you how I trimmed all that stuff. It's super easy with that tool and a knife. You could just trim the corners and then run it across the top. And before this is done, I'll take some sandpaper and just lightly sand that edge, because sometimes there's a little bit of glue left over, but in general that's pretty much done. So to finish this up, I just went through this morning and put screws through all those pieces. I put screws in the back as well. The trough is pretty rough form, rough shape. That's kind of what the photo showed. And then there is the pegboard done. You can see how those corks fit in there, with the sides veneered, and hopefully once they install this, they'll send me some finished photos.